Hello and welcome back to Talking Tropes. We've had a bit of a hiatus and trick or trope, it's Halloween time.
Ooh, I'm Hannah.
And I'm David, and we're doing tricksters because what's more Halloweeny than a tricky trickster guy? Um, Tricksters are a part of our culture, a part of maybe all cultures,
hmm
a part of storytelling that goes back as far as anyone has recorded. Uh, it's a Jungian archetype, which Carl Jung was a psychoanalyst who basically felt that there's a certain collective unconsciousness that we all sort of share these primordial functions in our brain, the self, the ego, and then other things branching off of that we perceive that maybe or maybe not based on actual physical structures in the brain, but that we all sort of collectively imagine. And there is an imagination of the trickster. I think that's pretty inarguable in the global media culture we have today. So we just thought we'd trace a little bit of that and talk about the modern the modern trickster versus the trickster of antiquity. So Hannah, where would you like to start on that journey, that monomyth, that hero's journey?
I mean, I feel like we got to start with if we're starting with gods, we got to start with Loki, you know?
Yeah, the trickster god is something that also has always been around. And I think maybe like a question we can use to kind of frame some of the discussion is
hmm
are tricksters good? Are they bad? Are they neutral? What is their alignment?
I mean, I think there are as many alignments as there are grains of sand, you know? Like I
Right.
don't I don't know if that's the most useful breakdown, I guess,
All
of
right,
like
then we'll
good
cut.
versus bad. No, no,
Then
no.
we'll
I
cut.
like talking about it. I think
We'll cut it all
sorry,
out.
I'm not I tricked you. Ah, no. I just think that, classifying good versus bad on like a moral spectrum doesn't really like tell us a lot, because it's like basing off of 21st century morality, it's like if they push someone down, they're kind of bad, like.
Right. Well, I mean, I guess you could say that like a trickster is there. A trickster
Yeah.
tricks somebody, which implies that
hmm
there are rules to a
hmm
form of engagement. And a
Yeah.
trickster flouts those rules or uses them to his or her own advantage,
hmm
which is a way of teaching moral lessons to people, which you could argue is what all stories are about. So the trickster can be bad and we learn to be not like the trickster, or the trickster can be good and we learn to use the cunning of the trickster for our own, our to help others or
Right.
something. So with a trickster god, some of the oldest versions of that are the gods or demigods who steal something from the gods to give to humans.
hmm
So Anansi the spider steals the language of the gods in order to give humans the power of speech, and
Right.
uh, and Maui
From Oh yes.
steals the fire of the gods to give humans fire, which is also what
Similar.
Prometheus does.
Exactly. Like, right. So I think for me, there's definitely, I notice a lot of, I want to say anti-authoritarian like traits sometimes to these trickster characters,
Mm-hmm.
where they notice um like some kind of unfairness based on the current structure of the world, structure of power, and they want to mess with that. And I think wanting to mess with that authority leads to some of the trickiness, because it's not always easy to directly challenge power, David. It's hard.
Right. But I think at the same time, I think tricksters have this tendency to fool petty humans because they are so much above us. And if your morality is centered on a pantheon of the gods which must be worshipped, they represent more threats. You know, a trickster is a threat to be avoided, but not necessarily a problem to be questioned. So, you know, we can think of well, I mean, let's start with Loki. Loki, who would often trick human beings by pretending to be not a god, and then turns out he is a god, and then you're smited. So it's, you know, teaching you to treat all as gods, because the trickster is multifacetous. It, you know, he has many faces. He can be she. He transcends gender and species, can be an animal.
Right. Like
transformative quality of trickster gods.
Right. I think, okay, that's it. That's the word that I think I've been like searching for in my brain. And I think I just didn't land on it because it was too obvious. Because often tricksters are shapeshifters. And I think like that is often their function in the story, is to be transformative in some way. And I think that this is true for gods, for you know, devils and magical creatures, and, you know, even true for you know, like animals. Those are sort of our three like strati, I guess, that we're grouping our tricksters into for this conversation.
Right. And I think that Jung would say that transformative quality is why the trickster is this archetype that occupies the space of the shadow or the other, because it's unknowable inherently. You cannot know the trickster's true nature. You cannot define it in specific qualities, but which also makes the trickster a great something to invest yourself in. You know, the trickster is neither male nor female, so the trickster represents all of humanity. And that's why so many like patron, like the god of all of everything, the creator of all, is so often a trickster of some kind. You know, we can think of you know, many Hindu gods, Indra, and also, you know, the avatars of Hindu gods on earth, like Krishna. There are plenty of other examples in Hindu mythology, but I'm not nearly an expert in that. But if you
are,
you know,
tweet at us and tell us about your cool Hindu trickster gods. We'd love to know more.
Right. Well, I guess like tricksteriness is just you know, it can be, you know, stealing some great power or withholding some great power. And so I feel like in Joseph Campbell's monomyth, it's so very often the trickster is associated with the end of the story, the like the meeting with the goddess, and then the claiming of the great elixir at the world navel, which, you know, for him it's like it's the center of the earth, but it's like just an unmoving place that connects earth with the higher plane, whether that's heaven or, you know, the world of gods, or you know, in the case of Loki, it's Valhalla, you know, but and it's Yggdrasil that connects us to Valhalla. So like there's a place where you go and you climb something like a mountain or a tree stalk or a vine or a beanstalk.
Yeah.
And you go and you steal something from the gods, some magic thing that they protect, and you bring it back down, and you've become a man or a fully grown adult, you know, whatever the initiation myth. And that's you know, Joseph Campbell's like anthropological use of Jung.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's often, so in that case, it's not necessarily like the god being the trickster themselves. It's you know, like Jack and the Beanstalk. It's
a normal
just
human
a guy
stealing from the gods.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry if I'm kind of all over the place, but yeah, like the Trickster Gods, like it's usually like a tale about like Zeus turned himself into a cow to have sex with a lady, or Dionysus, tricks what was his name, King Midas
Midas.
into he wishes for a golden touch, but then he
Mhm.
turns his beloved daughter into gold.
No.
So it's a be careful what you wish for sort of scenario.
Right. And I think, going back to what you were saying about like the shadow and the outsider, that's kind of the like that's the function there, of
Yeah,
saying be careful what you wish for, it might be bad. And then,
right.
there's the careful what you wish for, it might be good.
Right.
It's
So I
sort
mean
of,
that might make our listeners think of jinns or genies,
yeah.
um, sorcerers, conjurers, fairies, leprechauns, all manner of
Hmm.
mythical creatures, where the lesson is when you encounter the divine, the sublime, the beyond human experience,
Hmm.
watch your step.
Right. So, I have certain friends who, would describe that as like fey logic or fey puzzles.
Sure.
And I have another friend who sort of, I guess, sub-dubbed within the trickster canon, the sneaky genie archetype,
Right. Think
where,
Puck or Pan
right. Hmm.
or various other horned, bedeviled beastmen.
I mean, that's sort of the whole point of the Fae in sort of Celtic, like Anglo-Saxon, like folklore, is
uh,
that, they are these otherworldly, mystical, magical beings, but like they don't get you by like zapping you with their powers. They get you by you not knowing the rules of engagement and then saying, aha, now you're my slave forever, or
right.
presenting a challenge but then flipping the script on you in some way.
Right. But then
That's the
there's
key
always
to me
the,
there.
stories of overcoming the Fae, and, different cultures end up having different relationships with that great spooky other. And so
Mm-hmm.
we see in like Germanic folk tales, like that what eventually became Rumpelstiltskin, that he is this guy who shows up and he's like, hey, heard you needed some gold or else they're going to chop off your head. Um, I'll give you the gold in exchange for, something, a lock of your hair or whatever. And then he comes back and says, actually, now that you want more gold, I got to up the ante. I'm going to take your firstborn child. But, we got to give him a way out of it. So if you guess my name, then, then
You
we're
don't have to give me
good.
the baby.
And unfortunately, she asks for 3 days to figure out his name because it could be anything because he's a goblin of some kind, a Rumpelstilts, which is a type of German goblin.
There you go.
So she like tracks him down, I guess. I guess he's just that easy to find, and he just spends all his time singing to himself like "Heedly deedly dee, I'm Rumpelstiltskin, heedly deedly dee." And she's like, "Oh, I guess his name's Rumpelstiltskin."
That's good.
Uh,
Yeah.
we love him, but he has a more modern interpretation, as does Loki. So maybe we should talk about adaptation for television. Um,
Yeah. Let's do it. So, we're talking about Loki, obviously featured heavily in many of the Marvel movies to date.
right,
And as of now, has season one of a television show devoted to him and his trickstery ways.
right. And like we said about, Loki, does he inhabit a transgression of rules, or does he reinforce godly rule as a warning to humans? you
Hmm.
know he is a trickster force to be overcome with essentially brute strength, at
Hmm.
least in the first Avengers movie. um,
Right.
and to some extent in Thor, where you
Yeah.
don't defeat him by talking to him and repairing your broken family relationship, your sort of Shakespearean dramatic, like his seizing of the throne, like Edmund in what was that, King Lear.
I don't know. It's been a long
I'm not
time
up
since
to
I read King Lear.
I'm not up to my snuff on Shakespeare. Anyway, he's, you defeat him by punching him in the face and then like smashing the bridge.
Right.
And then he falls. Um, and then in Avengers he's defeated by punching him right in
Yeah.
his crowned
His
head.
snoot.
Right. And his crown with the horns, I've
Mhm.
heard or I've read that, horned tricksters are something of a common thing because it's animalistic and it's
Mhm.
masculine. And
Mhm.
so in cultures
It's
where the trickster is a masculine force, that like an oppressive fatherly figure, then you have this, the horns are spooky. And so, you see that on everything from Loki to
the devil.
Pan to the devil, Mephistopheles, different demons of various kinds.
Right.
It's a thing. Horns, spooky.
It's a thing. And doesn't I know in some conceptions of Shakespeare, Puck is sometimes given horns as well. Like
Yes,
it's sometimes
because
a
Puck is
fey
based on
trait.
Pan, and
Right.
Pan is one of these satyrs or whatever,
Right.
horned boys.
There's like a hedonisticness to the trickster as well, which I don't think we
Okay.
mentioned. I do, because they don't serve a higher authority than themselves, and sometimes they, like, Loki in the MCU, he wants to be that higher authority for a long time, but his goal there, like we see when he's taken over Asgard, all he's doing is like lounging around and putting on plays where like he's
Right. That
kind of
was
a
in
hero.
Thor Ragnarok.
Right.
So yeah, I think at that point that's when we see the limits of his duplicitousness. What does he do when he gets in power? And so
Mm-hmm.
then the question is, what do we do after he has essentially given up using his tricksterness for selfish reasons and is using it instead for the betterment of his people, for giving it back to humanity, as it were, when he
A more
tries to
noble
kill
purpose.
where he tries to kill Thanos, and thereby snatch the power of the gods from the big god fist man. um, so even though he is a god, he is a lesser god in this Marvel universe.
I think trickster gods tend to be sort of lesser gods.
Right.
Like they're and I think that's why they often have that transformationness. They want to transform into the most powerful version. They want to transform into something
Sure.
that can
They want to
make
steal
up
the
for
elixir of
their.
immortality and either
Sure.
use it for themselves or bring it back to humanity, whatever the point is.
Right.
I totally agree. But the elixir of immortality can be good or bad, depending on whatever
The
thing it is.
context.
Whatever they end up getting ends up ultimately being good, even if what they get is punishment. But they're getting something out of the deal.
Mm-hmm.
So that brings us to Loki, the show, the Disney
Yes.
Plus original series. And
Mm-hmm.
it markets itself as sort of a deconstruction of the trickster trope, or the trickster archetype. So
Mm-hmm.
is it? And let's talk about it and reach a conclusion.
We'll see. We'll see if we can get there. It's certainly a show that talks a lot about tricksters and what
Yeah,
it
Owen
means to be
Wilson's
a
going on.
trickster.
He says, "You're a trickster. What am I supposed to do? This is impossible. I can't work with a trickster. Um,
It's a
he's gonna
pretty good
trick
Owen
me."
Wilson.
But he, but one of the things is, I guess, that Loki, in a metafictional sense, cannot escape his tricksteriness. That even when
Mm-hmm.
he says, "I'm being totally honest with you right now," I'm so serious, you guys.
Mm-hmm.
He can't escape his labeling as a trickster god,
Right.
because he's mythologically inclined to be a trickster.
Right. And especially in the context of the show, which is highly, basically an authoritarian bureaucracy called the TVA is
Right.
keeping the timeline on track, and anything that diverges from that timeline gets the axe. They get
Right. So
pruned.
anything he does to trick that system is inherently transgressive, good, freedom, whatever our values as Americans towards like informational freedom, gaining
Mm-hmm.
access to secret files from the CIA or whatever. I really think the
Mm-hmm.
TVA is like so closely related to the CIA, and that therefore the conclusion that they come to, that the CIA was ultimately necessary to keep communism at bay or whatever threat, terrorist or otherwise, that threat of other forms of authoritarianism is secondary to the TVA. But that's my own spiel take on it. Um, but
We'll
what
do an
of
episode
what
on
of Lady
CIA
Loki?
archetypes.
What did you say?
Sorry. No, go ahead. Say your thing again.
But what of Lady Loki? I'm switching topics.
Sylvie, let's talk about Sylvie.
Right. Sylvie
She,
has shorter horns,
yeah,
and
because
one of them
she's
is
a
cut off.
girl. But that's true
So
of Loki as well. That happens to him. I forget when, but it definitely happens to him. One of his
in
horns
this
gets cut off.
show,
Not in this show, but in the movies somewhere.
one of the horns gets lopped off.
Yes. Yeah.
But he in this show is shown with full crown with little pokey horns most of the time.
Yes.
And so I think in a pure imagery sense,
Mm-hmm.
Sylvie is the castrated Loki, you know the distaff counterpart, the Minnie Mouse to
Mm-hmm.
his Mickey Mouse, in that
Mm-hmm.
she is secondary, where he's Adam, she's Eve.
Right. I mean, that's very much the case. And we can see that when Loki ends up meeting all of like many of the multiverse Lokis who, have been pruned before,
Right.
where basically all of them are just guy versions of him, whether they're young, whether they're old, whether they're black, like they're just all dudes. She's the only girl version of a Loki, of a trickster that we see.
Right. But I think the fact that he immediately falls in love with her, almost immediately falls in
Yeah.
love with this version of himself. It speaks to tales of incest in mythology, Oedipus, things like that. Warnings about the dangers of going on your little quests and whatnot, of venturing out into the world. It's also a story of the
I mean,
dangers
I
of
think,
embracing your own femininity, where Loki is an androgynous sort of character. In myth, Loki in fact gives birth to his steed, which is a 12-legged donkey or something. I don't know. It is what it is.
but he
But the
gives
point
birth
is, he's always had an element of femininity to him. He,
for
as a
sure.
shapeshifter, he transitions between different genders at different times, but for the purpose of trickery, which leads, I don't know if there's a direct line in this. It may just simply be that transphobia evolves tangentially to our mythology, but the idea of androgynous characters as tricksters, or characters that
Mm-hmm.
embody, female and male forms as tricky,
That
is
fluidity is scary. It's other, it's shadow. I think
right.
you're totally
It's
right.
but I don't want to just say like, and that's why people are transphobic today. But I think
No.
I think there's an element of our storytelling that trickster characters will dress in drag or behave, you know,
Right.
femininely in
Which,
order to trick male characters.
I think that lilt towards the chaos of the universe is definitely where the tricksters go. And I think that's why, at least from my experience, many gender queer and trans people, like, you know, they love the idea of like, my gender is chaos, my gender is trickster, you know, and sort of embrace these things that they have almost historically, mythologically been associated with.
Yeah, I totally agree. So in the end,
but back to Sylvie.
In the end, with the Sylvie Loki dynamic, the point is that his split in his psyche, which is represented in this other character, this distaff character, he is obsessed or in love with his own femininity, and his feminine side is terrified of his masculine super ego self, and his ability to enact his own will. And so the distrust sown eventually leads to murder and killing and the collapse of the system as it is. So how do we interpret this? How do we interpret the finale of Loki, the show, season 1?
Well, so I'm sort of trying to understand what you were just saying, because I'm not sure if I agree.
I mean, they're the same
100%.
character, you know, like
right.
They're different, but they inherently are multiple sides of the same character, which is true of a lot of characters that don't share the same name, origin, and everything, you know, like
right.
Holmes and Watson are obviously two sides of the same coin as well. You know, they're a split part of, and Moriarty is like his shadow self, his evil self, whatever. So this is not solely true of characters who share the same name, appearance, powers, history, but they do. So they are one.
Right.
One is man, one is woman. That's like the main difference. And we can interpret their differences as interpretations of masculinity and femininity, even if that's not the intention of the writers of the show or the actors. It comes across as, well, the woman in the story is, self-deterministic, completely dedicated to the cause, unquestioning, but also distrustful. And the masculine is wavering. It's he's facile, he switches sides readily, and he's only out for himself and the people he cares about, whatever.
Right. And it's always a question of like, can he actually care for others? Like and in the sort of the final confrontation,
right. Whereas that's never a question for the female version of himself.
Right.
It's never a question whether she might be a narcissist.
Yeah. I do want to just very quickly talk about the final confrontation scene where, they literally just stare at each other, and she's like, why can't we agree? And he's like, because you can't trust and I can't be trusted. And like, I feel like, there's
man versus statement. Woman in a nutshell. Yeah. Question mark.
Yeah.
It's a messy ending. But does it deconstruct the idea of a trickster and the idea of a gendered or androgynous or bi-gendered trickster in any way?
I mean, I don't feel like it necessarily, if there's an interrogation on gender happening, I think it's happening unintentionally. I don't think the show.
But that's not my point. My point is okay. It's happening.
I mean, do you think like?
I think something's happening. I don't know if I quite have like a neat little interpretation. I think the idea is, if we have these trickster gods and they're going up to the top of Yggdrasil to confront the Grand Allfather and steal what is essentially, the immortal elixir of freedom, and also the idea of infinite realities, which means infinite life, which means, immortality. They're going to steal that from this guy. And then the one guy says, wait, let's not do that. And he's being totally honest about it, he's not lying about it, but he cannot shed his identity as a trickster, is the idea that we must interrogate our trickster myths and say, are they really tricksters, or are they just being told that they are? You know, is there such a thing as a trickster? And that's the deconstruction. The gendered part is the female version of him is more him than he is, because she is unwilling to trust. She's out for herself. She has, you know, clear motivation. She's not questioning her tricksterness, and she tricks the guy into letting her into the house and then kills him, doesn't fall for whatever his manipulation is. So I think it's implying a sort of transition for Loki from masculine to feminine, and a transition of his tricksterness from masculine to feminine. Whatever that means for the narrative, I guess we'll find out more in season 2.
Right.
So it's not clean, it's messy, but there's something going on there because tricksters so often transcend gender, you know.
Right.
And to what end, I ask? To what end?
To the end of the timeline, David. The end of the timeline.
To the end of the timeline.
Should we talk about them devils a little bit?
Right. So boy. Right. So this is true of the end of Loki as well. You know, when you confront the big bad at the end, what he says is, I got a proposition for you. I got a deal. Let's make a deal. All right. He doesn't talk like that. But you know who does talk like that? Hades in Hercules, another, you know, trickster god, if ever there was one. Although in Greek mythology, it was more often Hermes who was seen as the trickster, the mischievous little imp guy. He could run fast. He was a messenger, and he would provide aid to heroes in a form that was sort of tricky, like he would give you riddles and stuff. Anyway, Hades in Hercules, Jafar. No, not Jafar.
Not Jafar.
Hades in Hercules.
Yeah.
Mephisto in Marvel Comics. Mephistopheles in Faust. What else do we got? Devils. The devil's in the details, I say.
Yeah. You know, I think, like, where are we putting Bill Cipher on this list? Like, is he a trickster god?
He's an extra dimensional being that loves chaos.
Right.
You know, we've talked a little bit about the ways in which, you know, these can be heroic and good tricksters, you know, aligned good. But what about the characters that are simply aligned chaotic, and that chaos can be good, bad, or evil?
Right. You know, we've got Q from Star Trek, the Joker, you know.
Right. Like, but whereas like Q and Bill Cipher from Gravity Falls and Hades and Mephistopheles and his Marvel interpretation Mephisto, they have infinite power. They can control all of reality, but they bound themselves and the universe to certain rules. And those rules are codified in deals, and those deals become, you know, deals selling your soul to the devil, whatever. And I think it speaks to a mythological fear of contracts and lawyers. You know, I'm not, you know, it's a bureaucratic other.
Sure. Yeah.
You know, I mean, so many representations of the devil or gods as bureaucratic, the sublime of bureaucracy in modern interpretations. That happens in was Good Omens, in I don't know, there's plenty of other ones.
But going back to, you know, what I was saying about Fae earlier, and how often you know, right, they rules lure you into, like, now you're my slave forever, like,
or they'll take advantage of the wording of a wish or request in the way that genies do. Yeah, in terms of Disney's Aladdin, which has sort of 3 key trickster tropes, 3 trickster archetypes within the larger archetype. You have Aladdin, who's a trickster thief, a petty, orphaned, street rat guy. He makes his own way, he fends for himself, he finds his own food, and he transgresses societal norms by stealing.
Mhm.
Then the genie, the possessor of all power in the universe, but who binds it to like 3 rules and says you can have 3 wishes, but the wishes all have to go wrong. So he is a trickster in that sense. And he's a cartoony sort of, jokester who plays pranks and whatnot.
Right.
And then Jafar, the evil advisor, who is a
Mhm.
trickster, I think, in his own right. Someone who, through silver-tongued cunning, convinces the person in power to do what they say by tricking them.
But I would argue against Jafar because he uses, well, I guess tricksters can use mind control because
Of course,
that's kind of what
it's
Sylvie does.
one of their favorite tools in the handbag is magical, magical convincing. But it's
Right.
also done through like he's supposed to have a silver tongue.
But
He's
we never see him really use his silver tongue. He just talks and
uh,
talks and
au
talks until,
contraire, he dresses as goes in disguise. He's a shapeshifter
okay.
as a prison old man, and he says, uh, "Remember the golden rule. Whoever has the gold makes the rules. Here, take this and go steal some gold for me. All I want is
Hmm.
a rusty lamp." And then he kicks him down a flight of stairs and says, "Ha ha, tricked you." And then he's
Yes,
ultimately defeated by trickery as well.
that's
So it's this holy trinity of tricksterdom. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Genie. Um, you know,
Jafar's the father, Aladdin's the
Obviously, I
son.
mean, look at him. In many ways, he's like a paternal sort of villain, a
Hmm.
masculine threat to the ego.
Hmm.
In a very Oedipal sense, he wants to sleep with the mother of this orphan, who he wants to sleep with, and that's where the conflict exists,
Uh-huh.
right? Or to look at other Disney type fare, the sea witch, what's her name? Uh,
Ursula.
Ursula. She
Yes,
has
definitely a
contracts.
trickster.
She's
Yep.
buying up people's souls, collecting them. She seeks power. She's a trickster.
She's a shapeshifter.
She's a shapeshifter, absolutely. She shifts in order to trick men with sexuality. It's a very feminine trickster trait, and she's
Hmm.
played or designed to look like a drag queen, so also embodying masculinity as well in her femininity. So
Hmm.
it's a lot of these things, and she's part animal, part human.
Right.
Like many
She's
tricksters,
stuck almost in this state of transition.
right? And I think the animal thing, I almost think it's just a holdover from the original tricksters, which come from more like animalistic, tribal, and shamanic cultures.
Hmm.
Um, the most common ones to look at, we mentioned Anansi the spider,
Hmm.
which is an Akan sort of religious figure, and then we have coyote, in
Hmm.
various Native American tribes. I can't
Yeah.
name them all right now, but trust me, it's a lot of them. It's not
Well,
just
and
one.
also, like Coyote has like different specifics based on the tribe that
Of
is
course,
telling the
but
myth,
we've grouped them anthropologically in that they refer to them as the species that it is, the
Right.
coyote, and it's sometimes more human-like and sometimes more animal-like, almost always trying to fly or trick a spirit into helping it fly and leave the ground. And it's a representation of like humanity's hubris in some ways, but also Coyote is the creator of all of the universe, who speaks the universe into existence, unless I'm misremembering it. So again, we have like the trickster god who creates everything, but then still wants to fool around and like mess with people,
Hmm.
and who, if you see it, you have to like ward away the bad spirits, because you've looked upon it, and therefore you have to cleanse yourself of the coyote's bad luck influence.
Right. Right. Um, yeah, there's like I'm actually thinking now, I didn't think about this earlier. There is a Pacific Northwest Native American tale that I grew up reading called The Raven.
Yes,
Where
ravens very, very often tricksters.
yeah, and in this particular story that I read, he he turns himself into some pine needles and then falls in some water and impregnates a lady that way.
Yes.
And is born as a human, so that he can like steal the sun or something. I forget,
because the sun is fire, and we
right.
have fire. Stealing fire so often is the example of the elixir of life.
Right. Well, and I think fire and trickster goes hand in hand, because it's that, fire's chaotic. It's hard to control.
Sure.
It transforms. It can
But
be
the
small and
trickster
then
is able to
big.
tame it, or control it, or steal it, or whatever, even though
Right.
it's a power
Or
boundless beyond our understanding.
yeah, I think those concepts tend to go hand in hand. If we're talking about animals, also there's a children's story about a deer and some tigers. It's called Mouse, Deer, and the Tigers, where basically the whole thing is just the tigers want to eat the deer, and so the deer's got to trick all the tigers in various ways to
Sure.
stay
I mean, it can
alive.
be any animal, but we see certain ones appear more often than
Sure.
others. Ravens, intelligent birds who do play tricks, throw rocks at people, collect, little glass baubles to give
Have
people.
memories and
Sure.
can communicate those memories.
Foxes, clever foxes, they appear in, Aesop's fables, as well as, some African tribal tales. They make their way into slave narratives in the United States, Br'er fox, and then going along with that, Br'er rabbit. The hare in almost every culture is seen as like this clever, beating the odds sort of character, the tortoise and the hare, but also, and this trickles down to Bugs Bunny,
Right. Yes.
So, I think a lot of our early like cartoon animation, a lot of that sort of derives from literary influence and from, comic strips and from a lot of things. But the characters ultimately evolve this sort of mythic quality. And I think they begin to, in some ways, like channel or embody like these ancient stories of hares, spooky, tricky hares that can outwit you and outrun you, but who are sometimes trapped in their own traps.
Right.
Yeah.
Like that's the thing that's interesting about tricksters as well. And I think this goes all the way up to gods, is that they're fallible, very much so, like they make, half the time they make as many mistakes as they like, as many times as they succeed, and I think that's true for Bugs Bunny. I think that's
Satan.
True for Satan. It's true for Loki. It's true for Puck. Like all of these people, it's too many machinations going at once, and they can't keep them straight. It's very much that kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, just to, I guess, for Satan, that he's always defeated, except for, when the apocalypse happens, and then he kind of wins, but then ultimately loses.
Yeah.
But Satan is most interesting, I think, when he is tricking mortals into giving him their eternal soul somehow. And that trickster vibe is that goes back to Genesis, where a lot of people argue that the snake is Satan, or something, as opposed to just a snake that can talk. But serpents in mythology, that's another sort of Jungian archetype. The serpent, the dragon, it's an enemy. It's also tricky. It's a trickstery kind of thing. And dragons will often make bargains or argue for their life, if they're talking dragons, of course, like in The Hobbit. And then you may need a trickster to trick the dragon out of his gold, or whatever boon you're trying to get.
Yeah, I think with animals, there's sort of like two subgroups of animal tricksters. And I could be totally wrong with this, but this is what I'm feeling. They're animals that are physically weak, that are not
Right.
predators, that are that rely on
Right.
their wits and their
And we see them
trickery
as
to survive.
representations of ourselves. They outwit the predators, and we learn from them and how to protect ourselves from predators. Or they're the predators.
The
The big
predators.
bad wolf is a trickster. He dresses up as a woman in order to eat a little girl.
Right.
You know, and we learn to avoid him for that reason, because he dresses like grandma. And then there are sort of, I guess, tricksters for simpler moral lessons, like the Cat in the Hat, who is an animal trickster, or for more comical stories like Puss in Boots, where I think the comedy is pushing an agenda, it is questioning an authority.
Which comedy often does, like
comedy often does. So a lot of tricksters appear just in spoken word jokes, just like, two popes walk into a bar or whatever. But there are certain characters that appear in spoken word jokes that can be part of like a mythology of a culture. For example, Herschel of Ostropol, who gained acknowledgement in Eastern European Jewish communities during one of many particularly dark times in Jewish history. And he was an idiot who spoke the truth. That was the joke, basically, is he would say something stupid and self-serving, but he would, through wordplay, trick somebody out of something that they wanted. So like the classic joke is he says, "I'll take 2 bagels," and they give him 2 bagels, and he says, "Actually, I want 2 donuts," and he gives them back, and he takes 2 donuts. He eats them, and then he leaves, and then the guy says, "You didn't pay for them," and he says, "Well, I paid for them with the bagels." And then they say, "Well, you didn't pay for those either," and he says, "Well, I didn't eat them," and then he leaves. So it's a humorous joke on the idea of transaction and wordplay and poor people and being Jewish and poor and hungry. Right. But
I think
many of my friends and well-wishers will know of my my love of the book Herschel and the Hanukkah Goblins.
The best Hanukkah book ever. It's the best.
Where he tricks a bunch of goblins into letting him celebrate Hanukkah. So it's representative great. Of, tricking anti-Semites into letting us be Jews.
Right. But, it's going and saying, finding ways to trick an authority into giving you what you want, and oh boy, if the Jews could have had that.
Right. And I think the same goes for the slave narratives in the United States, which, can be traced to so many different roots and origins, to Native American tribes, to West African, like Ghanaian stories, about hares and rabbits. But, all the Uncle Remus stories, which, there was no Uncle Remus, he was made up by a white guy to sell these slave folk tales. But Br'er Rabbit and the Tar Baby, that's like a classic story about the traps that are laid out by predators, whatever, which I think have to represent, oppressive
slavers,
white slavers capturing and stealing young black
colonial powers
and black people. So I think it represents a questioning of power there that it doesn't in, for example, representations where the trickster is the devil, or where he's Q from Star Trek The Next Generation, where he's an all-powerful being that you have to trick to prove that you're, that you're more cleverer, but he controls everything and he loves riddles. He's like, riddle me this, I'm smarter than you. Which is the case of the Riddler in Batman as well. I don't know. Where do we go next? I'm not ready to wrap up. I just feel like we've talked about a lot of different things, and I've suddenly lost the plot.
So we were talking about animals.
That's right.
Do we want to go back to animals?
Let's go back to animals. So many of you may be familiar with the character Son Goku from Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z. What you might not know is that his name, powers, and appearance are all borrowed from the Chinese version of the character Sun Wukong from Journey to the West, who is a clever monkey who masters the Tao and Buddhism and all of that while being like the little shit about it. Like he's a representation of our childish sort of unwillingness to take the time to learn about the universe and to respect the powers that be. So in a way, he's a trickster where he transcends, the authority. He like practically gives a middle finger to the Buddha and says like, I'm faster than you. I can escape your hand, no problem. And then the Buddha's like, well, my hand's pretty big. It's so big that no matter how far you go, you'll still be in my hand. And, like he sticks it to him, but then he's punished for it by being buried under a mountain for 500 years. But then he redeems himself by learning obedience through having this, crown on his head that can be tightened by his master, who's this monk who's traveling to the West to learn about the true sattvas of, the true stories of Buddhism from actual Indian people. Anyway, the only thing I watched to learn about that was the Osamu Tezuka adaptation, which was released in the West as Alakazam the Great. But, I just think it's interesting, like Goku, he's got a staff that can grow. He can transform, and he's got a monkey tail, and he can fly on a cloud. And those are all things that Sun Wukong does. And his name, Sun Wukong in Japanese, is Son Goku. So it's the same thing.
I like what you're saying about the and bringing up like the childishness of Sun Wukong, because I don't think that's something we've like explicitly touched on yet. Is like, we've touched on how they're chaotic, that these tricksters are somewhat anti-authoritarian, they're sometimes hedonistic, egoistic. We've touched on the fact that they're funny, but I think the childishness is like the immaturity.
Self-contradictory because their childishness and their authority, but you
can be in a childish authority, like that. I don't think that's a contradiction.
Well, I'm just saying they embody both in the same being, a childishness, and they can also embody a paternalistic masculinity, like don't get in trouble, like tricking you into doing what they want you to do.
But I mean, that's kids love doing that. Kids love pulling tricks on their parents. And because again, I think being a child is a place that is lacking power, and so the only way to gain power over your parents sometimes is to trick them, oh yeah, mom, I'm totally going to bed right now. I don't have my laptop hidden under like my pillow, and I'm gonna immediately go back on.
Campbell writes in his writing about the monomyth that in the childhood of a lot of heroes, they will demonstrate unreasonable feats of strength, unreasonable feats of morality, and unreasonable feats of trickery to demonstrate their destiny of eventually claiming, it's always foreshadowed that eventually they'll claim the bounty of the immortal elixir. In Maui's case, when he's just a baby, he slows down the sun so that his mom will have time to finish cooking or something before sundown. And I think it was Krishna is like presented with like the demonic breast of a poisoned lactating woman, and he sucks the evil out of her and like purifies her or something. So he's like dealing with trickery and like flipping the trick on them or something. I don't know.
So that's common, you would say, in heroic trickster tales.
Yeah, when they're eventually going to go on to be a great trickster warrior who saves humanity or whatever. Probably when they're a kid, they're a mischievous trickster who pulls harmless pranks for fun or accidentally does good while trying to steal cookies or something.
Are there, I think, to sort of bring it to modernity now, throughout this conversation, and maybe it's just because I revisited this book recently, But I'm thinking of Harold and George from Captain Underpants and how they fit
Right,
into the trickster
pranksters in
archetype.
general. I mean, there's so many
Yeah,
subtropes that
right.
we definitely wouldn't have time to cover all of them, but
Hmm.
just to go through a few, the Artful Dodger is like a, a wastrel. I don't know, like a what's the word? Like an orphan boy on the streets who like cons you out of your wallet, but like is happy to
Yeah.
be a homeless. Um, the
Yeah.
Barnum is, named after P.T. Barnum, a sort of carnival trickster who tricks you out of your money with like carnival games or taking you in to see a show that's really cheap and exploitative, stuff like that.
Right.
The con man or grifter, that's
Hmm.
like a very common type of trickster, or the thief, the gentleman thief is a type of
Mwah,
trickster.
mwah. Love a gentleman thief.
Lupin or um, I don't know, the Ocean's 11, whatever.
Yeah.
uh, Court jesters and fools are tricksters in a sense. They often bend this story to their will while also narrating how silly it all is. In Shakespearean tragedies, there's somehow always like a clown over there just going like, ha
Hmm.
ha, silly.
Yeah. We mentioned fairy tricksters and foxes.
Yep.
We mentioned characters who, sort of rules lawyer everything into like a game where, they're
Yeah.
always in control.
Right, the chess master.
Hmm.
There's one listed on TV tropes called the Great Gazoo, which I think is an interesting sort of take on that Fey logic that we talked about, where this is someone who so little understands humanity that they end up granting a wish that they think is helpful while actually hurting someone.
Right. I mean, the
Think
one
of
my,
Ella Enchanted,
yep.
where the fairy says, "I give you the gift of obedience," and then it becomes a curse
Right.
that she can only do what other people say.
Right. The
Um,
unintended consequences
right.
of, those kinds of tricksters.
And then another one is the Wonka, which speaks for itself, I think.
Yep.
He's
Yep.
he's encouraging people to fall prey to their own vices in order to teach them a lesson while secretly always being in control. He pretends that he has no idea what's going on and why people keep getting into mischief in his factory. um, it's pretty straightforward. And then the tramp,
Yeah.
pretty straightforward as well. The tramp is a character from Charlie Chaplin. Charlie Chaplin was a clown who pointed out inequities in his society through just tripping over himself like a fool or an idiot.
He was
Whereas,
a genius.
the Marx Brothers, they were less like haphazard, like accidental tricksters where they were intentionally tricking people. Um,
Hmm.
Stuff like that.
Yeah. So I think, we've covered a wide breadth
Right.
of tricksters at this point. Do we have like, is there, like if we were gonna make a Venn diagram of like trickster traits, where it's like, here's things that could be trickster and different characters overlap in different places. Do we
Well, I
have,
don't know if I have that, but I have this
okay.
quote. So this is a quote from a psychoanalyst named Donald Kalshed, who wrote a book about archetypes in a Jungian sense. And he writes, in mythology, archetypal representatives of the archaic self's ambivalent nature are always tricksters. The trickster is ideally suited to be an agent of transformation because he or she carries both sides of a split in the psyche. The trickster is evil and good, loving and hateful, male and female, and thus holds the opposites together while also keeping them differentiated. Shape-shifting at will, he/she is the transformer who also gets transformed. So it's a representation of change, whether that is a change that is transgressively, undermining a system, or just simply changing the self through growth and learning lessons. So,
Mhm.
while the trickster is amoral, it is nevertheless the energy that forces morality upon us by providing alternatives, both inspirational and uncomfortable, so that we are fully cognizant of our choices. That was a quote from Terry Waddle, who wrote a book called Wild/Lives, Trickster, Place, and Liminality on Screen. So something to check out.
Yeah. And I hope that for our listeners, this sort of served as like a really nice primer to the trickster trope. We opted for breadth versus depth, and digging into a particular kind of trickster, particular trickster character. There are tons of books and research done around this topic constantly. It's as we've said, it's everywhere. Every culture's got a trickster. I bet you could go find any show. This is a fun activity for you guys at home. Turn on your favorite TV show and see if you can find a trickster character.
Right.
Like, I bet you can. Is
right.
my
even
take.
In silly sitcoms, Jim Halpert is a prankster.
Right.
Jeff Winger is a grifter.
Right.
Silly stuff like that.
Mhm.
In anything supernatural, there's always going to be like a Beetlejuice or somebody to mess things up, or
right.
Or, if you're dealing with superheroes, there's going to be a shapeshifter who's going to do something tricky, I'll bet you, Mystique or something like that. If you're watching something about a labyrinth or a maze or a lost woods that tricks you, tunnels that keep shifting, there's some kind of trickery going on. And if somebody keeps switching sides, someone's disloyal to their alliances, like in Game of Thrones. You can bet dollars to donuts that Tyrion Lannister is a trickster. So
I would say Littlefinger is more of the trickster
also that
than Tyrion, but
I have them both on this list.
So yeah, tweet at us what your favorite trickster is at Talking Tropes.
Yes. And
we'll see you next week.
Or will we not? Because it could be a trick.
Ooh,
trick or treat.
Happy Halloween.